Good morning, everyone. My name is Richard Waldron, and I am a lecturer in planning at Queen's University Belfast. And my short presentation today is called Finance, Real Estate and the De-Democratisation of Planning. I've been particularly interested in the ways that the planning system has been reshaped in the years coming out of the last financial crisis, and the ways that some of those policy changes are actually serving to limit citizens' engagement with the planning system. Just to give you some background, obviously coming out of the last crash, we know that the banking and the development sectors in Ireland were badly affected. House prices had fallen by over 50% by 2012. NAMA had obviously gone about its process of extracting the development debt out of the Irish banks, and then gone about a process of renationalising or reprivatising many of those assets by selling them back to investors, often on pretty favourable terms. At the same time, building activity had collapsed, supply had plummeted by over 90%, even though demand, particularly within Dublin, remained very, very strong. So it's this supply-demand imbalance that is at the centre of our housing crisis, and it's driving what is often referred to as problems of development viability or financial viability, which really is trying to capture a whole series of different issues for the development sector around planning, fiscal and financing barriers. Indeed, within the crash, the development sector has often presented planning as being a particular barrier to housing supply. The Urban Land Institute has actually said the planning system is not set up to facilitate development, it's actually set up to slow down development, which appears to me as a bit of an overreach. Whereas the Property Industry Ireland have argued for a fast-track planning mechanism to speed up planning, even though fast decision-making rarely leads to good decision-making, as we've seen through the SHD process. This narrative around development viability is a bit problematic from my perspective. It's not immediately clear how development viability is actually defined, or how planners should actually interpret it, or should they interpret it at all within their decision making. Rather, the term is loosely used to capture a whole series of different planning, finance and demand side issues for the industry. Industry has argued that the state is too reliant on development levies and planning gain contributions to fund affordable housing and local service provision, that our building standards are overly generous, which add costs, that our planning system is over democratic, which adds time delays, and that planners don't understand the financial implications of their decision making. On the finance side, they've argued they've been unable to access low-cost finance and therefore need state-backed sources of funding. They've argued construction taxes are too high and need to be reduced, and they need new fiscal incentives and investment structures to facilitate investment. They've also argued to stimulate the demand side, particularly relaxation of restrictions around mortgage lending. And essentially, they've argued that property prices need to rise and that purchasers need to be supported to meet that rising cost. The state has been particularly responsive to some of these claims, particularly through the planning system. Indeed, we saw the scrapping of the windfall tax on land rezoning back in 2015. That was followed by reductions in development levies. We've also seen a halving of planning gain commitments, at least for a period of time, through Part 5. We saw the introduction of specific planning policy requirements, which then introduced new minimum apartment size standards and new height standards, which again were quite facilitative to industry. We've seen the introduction of build to rent as a specific use class in planning, and the introduction of the fast-track planning mechanism, which again has been quite problematic from a participation point of view. We've also seen the privatisation of public land through the Land Development Agency, and these are only some of the ways that the state has responded to facilitate the construction. So I think this is problematic for the planning system in a number of different ways. I think we're seeing the centralisation of decision-making powers through the SPPR process, where the minister can effectively override policies established through the local development plan process. We're seeing a raised bar for citizen participation, particularly through the SHD process, which removed third-party appeals and allowed material contraventions to be made to development plans through the board. And we're also seeing new proposals to restrict grounds for judicial review. We're also seeing a more market-led approach to policy development, and I think industry actors have had a significant role in shaping the state's policy response in planning, but have, in fact, many of these responses have not led to a significant increase in affordable housing supply. I think the implications for policy and practice are clear. I think we're seeing an increased centralisation of political influence over the planning system and its institutions, which is problematic. Industry perspectives have been more readily accommodated in policy development than other stakeholders. To counteract this, we need a greater emphasis on public consultation at the policy-making stage, and planners need to critically interrogate the claims of other stakeholders and resist the perpetual calls for reforms that link social, economic and political challenges to claimed failings within planning. Thanks very much for your attention, and I'm more than happy to take any additional questions.